So, writing a compelling conference presentation. The things I'm going to cover in this section include brainstorming, working out what is your story angle, doing all the necessary things, and I'll explain what they are, and then situating your conference presentation within a broader conversation. So the first paragraph is 100 words, and the 3 paragraphs are obviously 300 words. And so you want to aim to write between 100 and 300 words for your abstract or your personal statement. I don't mind if you are super concise and write a really short personal statement. That doesn't bother me. But it is harder to assess a really short personal statement. Like sometimes we get them in their 2 sentences. And it's more difficult to assess those because they don't explain how they know what they know. They don't put in the step that I mentioned before about saying this is from an evaluation, this is from my lived experience, this is from my practice wisdom. They don't spell out why we should believe the claims that they're making in the personal statement. Okay, so the first step in putting together a conference presentation is to brainstorm all your thoughts. Get it all out on Post-it notes or on a big sheet of paper. Get the highlighters out, get the texters out, get the sticky notes, go crazy. Write down everything that you can think about in relation to the topic. The next step after that is to start grouping the items together. And you can see that in the image that I've included on this slide, I've started putting related ideas into columns. And the columns that have more sticky notes in them are better developed themes, right? There is more going on in that theme. I can have a more rich and in-depth exploration of what's happening in that theme than I can with a single sticky note that's floating on its own. And the single sticky notes often have really important insights on them, but they might come in towards the end of your presentation as a kind of caveat or an additional insight rather than as the meat and the potatoes, or the lentils and the rice if you're a vegetarian of the presentation itself. The next thing I want to suggest is coming up with a single story angle. And the idea of an angle comes from journalism. So this is an invitation to see a conference presentation as a narrative. And a narrative unfolds over time with a beginning that introduces a problem, a middle that creates a sense of adventure and discovery, and a climax that is findings that resolve the problem, with a conclusion that presents some implications for the future. And if you think about your conference presentation this way, it's much easier to think about how would it flow? What do I put first? What comes second? What comes third? And it's a bit less intimidating to think about a conference presentation as a story rather than as a kind of an argument that you are making to a professional audience. And your abstract is the same thing. It is a story. It's just a short one. Like a newspaper article or a TV news story, a good abstract has a clear and strong story angle that tells the story from a unique and striking perspective. And a good story angle creates curiosity. It's a bit like clickbait in that respect. Clickbait in a heading that says, you won't believe this one trick that led to Daniel being able to stay awake without a 3 p.m. coffee. If you care about Daniel's sleep patterns, then you will, of course, go, well, yes, I want to know what that one weird trick is. So you click through to the article and you discover it's taking zinc or vitamin D3 or whatever the magic solution might be. Now, obviously, clickbait has been overused and we all find it easy to spot and probably find it a bit frustrating. But a good story angle has a similar effect, creates curiosity. The reviewer goes, I want to see where this goes. I want to hear what happens next. I want to hear how you explain this challenge or this problem. So they accept your abstract for presentation. And I asked AI, what is a story angle? And it said a story angle is the specific viewpoint or perspective from which a story is told, It guides the writer's focus and how details are presented. It helps to narrow down a broad topic and present it in a unique and engaging way. And essentially, it's the why or the so what behind the story that makes it compelling and relevant to the audience. So choosing a story angle for your abstract, you might ask yourself, what makes this new? What is something that this audience hasn't heard before? Similarly, what's surprising about this? But you might also ask what makes these various details or my different sticky notes hang together as a narrative? Like, why did I group them into columns or stacks of sticky notes? What is the theme that makes them hang together? And lastly, you might ask, what makes me the right person to tell this story? And I've noted some limitations of AI. It's probably pretty good at the first two questions, but it's going to be bad at question 4 because it doesn't know you personally. You can feed it your CV and it will draw answers from your CV, but it doesn't know you well enough to say, here's why Anth McCarthy is the person who should tell this story at the conference. And it may provide cliched answers to question 3, like I've asked AI to come up with a story about people with HIV responding to their diagnosis, and AI came back with this very heartwarming narrative about a person who got their diagnosis, struggled with it, overcame the challenges, created their own organization, and is now the CEO of an organization that supports 300 people in their state or territory. Really, like, inspiring, but sets very high standards if you are a person working out how to respond to a diagnosis, and probably not the reality of most people's experience. All right. I'm going to talk a bit more about AI towards the end as well, because I've softened my position on AI since the last time I ran this webinar. The next thing we need to do in our abstract is do all the necessary things, and I'll explain what they are. You need to tick off the conventions of the format. Remember before I talked about how an abstract has to fit into a genre, and genres have expectations. If you're writing a romance novel, then you need a woman who's facing, or a gay man who's facing some significant challenge affecting their identity. And they need to meet a tall, dark, mysterious, handsome stranger who possibly provides answers or maybe just provides solace to them in their time of woe, right? So if you're thinking about a romance novel, then you need to set up certain expectations very quickly early in the narrative. And writing an abstract is very much the same thing. And some of the conventions are, this particular topic is important. There is a gap in our knowledge. We don't know about XYZ. Describe what action you took to close the gap. I did ABC. We did an in-house evaluation. I consulted practice wisdom. I drew on my lived experience. Describe the key findings briefly. You don't need to go into much depth. It's just a kind of teaser for the audience, making them think, yes, I'm curious. I want to hear more about this. Discuss the future implications. So how could it change the work that people are doing? Acknowledge limitations. This is limited because there was a small sample size. Disclose any conflicts of interest, and that one's important. If you've been to a pharmaceutically funded event, you might want to disclose that as a potential reason why your findings might be influenced. So as diagram, here is the structure of an abstract. And I'm drawing here again very strongly on research. So if you find that your abstract doesn't fit this structure, don't panic. It might just be a practice abstract rather than a research abstract. But this is how we would do it in academia. You start with a bit of general background, then you provide a bit of specific background, narrowing the field. You say what the knowledge gap is. You say, here we show, and provide a brief summary of the results. And lastly, some implications for future practice. And this is an example that I found in the wild. In other words, I stole it from the web, but the URL is on the right. And this highlights those structural features in an abstract about horizontal gene transfer, so I'm not going to pretend to understand the material, but you can see very clearly one sentence general background, one sentence specific background, one sentence knowledge gap. Here we show, and then about, I think that's still only 2 sentences, but 2 very long sentences that are very crunchy with detail. Results with key concrete values, and then lastly, the meaning of the results, or alternatively, you could do the future implications of the results in that section. The last bit that I want to talk about here is locating yourself, right? Location, 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 as the real estate agents would put it. At the peer national gathering, we're aiming to have conference presentations of between 10 and 15 minutes, so reasonably chunky amount of time. 2 or 3 people talking about current issues or problems, 2 or 3 people talking about innovations in the field, 2 or 3 people talking about best practices. So it's not a huge number of presentations. And there are a few different ways that you can present what you might want to talk about in your abstract. If you are thinking about other conferences like ASHM and IAS, they usually use 4 or 5 tracks. They have basic science, which is cells and microscopes, and gas chromatographs, and the CRISPR and all the technologies that they use to do operations on cells. They do clinical and translational science, which is where that stuff turns into white coats and stethoscopes. They do prevention and epidemiology, which in my worldview means graphs and stats. And then they often have track D or track D and E, which consider social, cultural, policy, economic, and implementation considerations. Or as my GP friend, Dr. Trent Yarwood puts it, literature and poetry. And I just love that because it's so rude. So rude about the work that my entire career is based on. But anyway, choosing a location for the abstract, have a think about the different track committees and the reviewers on those track committees who are likely to read your presentation. So your abstract could be about PrEP, which would normally fit into prevention, and prevention and epidemiology is track C. But if you were talking about PrEP stigma, you might get a more informed and sympathetic audience from track D, which is literature and poetry, or the social, cultural, policy, and economic aspects of HIV, compared to track C, which is focused more strictly on prevention and activities that we can do to reduce the number of people who get HIV in any given year. If prevention is doctors and statisticians, track D is more likely to be social scientists and people like me who work in the field. And we tend to understand the impact that stigma has a bit better than our colleagues further upstream do. So you might choose a track where you're guaranteed or more likely to get a sympathetic audience. Now, here is the broad structure for a research-based abstract. And you need to know this because this is kind of the gold standard, and even the practice abstracts will get compared to this format. This is the format recommended by ASHM, by the way. ASHM say we want to hear background that shows the topic is important and there's a gap in our knowledge. Methods, we took the following reproducible steps to address the gap. Results, we describe the findings in brief. Conclusion, the status of the gap, it remains open or it has been closed, and we have the following implications and limitations. And if I scroll back up to this, it's very similar, right? Describe the background, provide the gap, tell us what you did, tell us what you found, what are the implications, what are the limitations. Okay, practice abstracts. Conferences like ASHM and IAS offer the option of writing a practice-based abstract rather than a research-based one. The problem is, even in track D and E, the reviewers for these abstracts are nearly always researchers and they tend to review practice-based abstracts poorly. So the best abstract I ever wrote, the most important paper I ever submitted, got a review score of about 32%, because everyone in the abstract committee, and I was on the abstract committee, everyone else was a researcher. So they weren't supposed to show me that result, but I did get to see it and I was crushed. But it happens because the reviewers are academics and they're comparing what you wrote to this structure. So if you do write a practice-based abstract, consider writing it using this format instead. And you must explain how you evaluated your program and generated your findings. You can't trust that the audience is going to go, oh, obviously that's from lived experience and practice wisdom. You have to explain, I drew on my lived experience, I drew on my practice wisdom, I talked with other people about the topic, and I ran a focus group, right? So you want to give people the explicit methods that you followed in order to come up with the findings. This is what Asham recommends as the structure for a practice-based abstract. They say, describe the background and purpose, why it matters, describe the approach taken or what you did, describe the outcomes or the impact, what happened, and how do you know that, right? Always spell out the knowledge practices that you drew on to come up with your findings about what the impact was. And lastly, answer the innovation and significance project. How is this new and why is it important? Okay. Last minute checks before you hit submit. Do a spell check, do a word count. Ask someone else to proofread because you've probably gone over it so many times that you've stopped seeing the individual words on the page.